to begin. Thank you everybody for coming back from the coffee break for our last session this afternoon. We have three very important speakers and a respondent from various countries and parts of the world and various cultures and languages. I want to say first that I'm very proud and excited to be here. It's a huge honor to be here in Hong Kong at HKBU, and I want to say that what a tremendous historical moment it is to have this event on Tibetan literature and Tibetan film and Pema Tseden's films here in Hong Kong, especially at this particular time. But even thinking about the whole history of the development of awareness in the world of Tibet as an important subject of study. Today, this conference is an important turning point where the community, the intellectual community in Hong Kong, turns its attention in a serious intellectual academic manner to the question of this culture, as I'm sure you will do for other cultures within China as well, including studies of Uyghur culture, as well as I know Dr. Yeung and Sepula are already working on that topic. So I want to congratulate you all on this extraordinary, important effort. But our first speaker in this panel this afternoon is himself a Tibetan, perhaps the first Tibetan I think we've heard from in this conference. Ren-qing is from Amdo, which is the Tibetan northeastern area of the Tibetan plateau, mainly consisting of Qinghai and parts of northeastern Sichuan. Ren-qing is well known as a writer. He went to school and was brought up in a place in Tibetan called Chapcha, or in Chinese Gonghe, which is in Hainanzhou, just south of Kokono, Lake Qinghai. He was actually at the same high school as Pema Tseden. They were at school together, shared textbooks and sat together in their childhood. Pema, they both became writers, and Ren-qing has remained a writer. He has, I think, one book of Tibetan stories in Tibetan and another book of stories in Chinese. And he's a member of the Chinese Writers Association in Shanghai, and well known there for one of these significant writers who's able to work in both languages with equal fluency. Please welcome Ren-qing.
大家下午好，非常高兴能够有这样的一次机会，跟大家见面，能够和大家一起探讨万马才旦先生的电影、小说和翻译作品。也非常荣幸，非常感谢这个京汇大学的邀请，谢谢杨慧怡教授。 今天我来我来这个香港已经是3天了。这2天的感受就是，如果会英语就非常的好，但是差不多我连1句英语都不会说，只能会说几个单词吧。所以就是今天我这样的一个演讲是要用中文。当然我在我的家乡可以自由地穿行在这个藏语和汉语之间吧。 所以今天的这个演讲不能用我擅长的这个藏语，心里还是小小的有一些遗憾。今天下午是这个要探讨的是万马才旦先生的翻译作品的这样一个单元，但是我的这个今天的这个演讲呢，它会涉及到电影和小说。我今天想说的这个题目是。 民间叙事背景下的万马才旦的作品的艺术诉求。 民间叙事是万马才旦的这个电影、小说翻译作品的一个鲜明的文本的一个特征。这种特征并不单单是在他的这个作品当中的结构和叙事上，他呢通过这样一种特征，想用这种民间叙事这样一种来自民间又能够回到民间、影响民间的方式，达到他对藏族、藏文化的这种新的理念和新的认知的一种传达。所以我认为，就是万马才旦的这个文学作品，包括电影，包括这个翻译的这样的一些作品呢，带着一种宗教的意味儿。万马才旦有一种书写佛经的一种冲动。中国国内的这个民间艺术家协会的主席，著名的作家冯骥才先生呢，他曾经说过这么一句话。他说：“民间文学是山野文化的精灵，更是作家们的一座语言富矿，值得那些勤奋而独具慧眼的作家开采利用，并受用终生。”但是就我个人理解啊，就作家个体而言，民间文学并不单单是供作家开采利用的富矿，它对作家的人格品质的塑造和精神取向的形成有着更大的意义和作用。这一点比作家从民间文学中挖掘创作素材和借鉴民间语言更为重要。可以说，民间文学更应该是作家成长成熟的精神土壤。任何一个作家的血脉中，都有来自民间文学这片精神土壤的血液和营养。这个有人说，任何一个民间故事都会在它流传的过程中被改写。那么这种被改写的依据是什么呢？显而易见，依然是我刚刚提到的族裔文化或者区域文化的文化背景在影响和操作这种改写。也就是说，任何一个民间故事的被改写，都是为了适应某种族裔或者区域的文化背景的需要，是在一种特性文化的需要下，顺应着这种文化的需要而被改编的。说到这里，我要说说生活在青藏高原及其周边地带的藏民族的文化背景。大家都知道，由于佛教的传入和广泛的传播，并和藏地原始宗教的完美融合，使得整个藏地几乎成为一个全民信仰藏传佛教的这样一个地方。在日常生活中呢，处处受到藏传佛教的影响。那么，这也成为藏地民间文学在流传中被改写的文化依据或者是文化背景。也就是说，藏地的民间文学深深地打上了藏传佛教的烙印。藏地的民间文学有着诸多的佛教的精神，比如刚才这个像罗老师他们也提到了啊，比如说利他、施舍、隐忍，以及对来世幸福的这种看重等等吧。虽然文化背景也会受到不同时代不同的政治以及这样一种政治所操纵下的宗教取向的影响，并在精神和世俗层面上表现出不同的样式和特点，但藏传佛教的深远影响，使得藏民族形成了一种坚实的、有着持久的生命力的共通的民间文化心理素质。我说这么多，是想表达的是，这就是哇玛才旦先生成长成熟的精神土壤。在哇玛才旦的电影作品还有小说作品中，出现和引用了大量的藏族民间文学作品。我这里粗略地做了一下统计，比方说有这个诗语故事，就是说不完的故事，有唐僧喇嘛传，也就是这个汉族的《西游记》，有智美根灯，有格萨王的片段，还有他新的电影《五彩神剑》里头，是依据了这个一个刺客叫拉隆贝吉多杰，他刺杀了藏王之后，跑到青海，在 青海密修佛法，然后把这个射箭的这样一种技艺传播到这个地区的这样一个民间故事。因为今天是要让我谈瓦玛才丹先生的翻译嘛，我就这里谈一谈这个瓦玛才丹的第一部这个翻译的作品，叫《说不完的故事》。这个说不完的故事，这个在藏语中的原意就是这本书的原意，简单的翻译就是如意宝师所讲述的神通故事。母如最终就是母如一个如意宝师若你这紧，他所讲述的一些有着神通的故事，这样一本书。这个故事的结构特别像这个西方的那个《1001夜》，是一个框架式的结构，就是把故事用一条线这样穿起来的这样一个结构。说不完的故事在藏区的这种流传，是有2个方式，一个是书面的，另外一个就是口头的。这个故事大概有30多个故事这样子的。这个故事也是从这个印度传来的，它和这个佛教传入的渠道是一样子的。但是它这个传到藏区之后呢，在藏地，我刚才提到的被改写，它是经过被改写的这样一个故事。帕玛才丹先生早年求学于兰州的西北民族大学，就是原来他上学的时候，那时候叫西北民族学院。他所学的专业就是藏汉汉藏的翻译专业。根据这个专业要求，毕业的时候，他选择翻译了之前已经有前辈曾经翻译过的这个小说，这个故事集。这个故事集在瓦玛才丹先生之前已经有前辈翻译过，但是他依然是选择了去翻译这样一部藏族民间的故事集。他个人认为，他做这样一种选择的原因是，一个是想从民间故事的翻译中学习民间语言，尽力以朴素的汉语表达这本故事集所呈现出的朴素的藏语。二是想影响他走向艺术创作之路的民间文学表达敬意。此前，瓦玛才丹对民间文学、对一片地域、一个族裔的影响力及其意义已经熟知于心。他知道这样一种工作不但对藏民族本身是存在意义，通过翻译也可以将藏文化中的那些具有普世价值的东西传播得更远。正是基于这样两个目的，瓦玛才丹重新翻译完成了这个故事集。故事集先后由甘肃民族出版社和青海人民出版社出版。在稍后由青海人民出版社出版的这本故事集上，瓦玛才丹先生呢特意在书名里头加了“西藏”2个字。他自己认为，这是他想通过这本故事集流传区域的一个强调，就西藏这样一个地域的一种强调，增强读者对这样一个有着极强的藏文化元素的故事集的辨识度。因为书名里头如果没有“西藏”2个字，只是说是说不完的故事，可能他对一个不了解西藏的这样一些人是没有辨识度的。继而使西藏以外热爱西藏和藏文化的人们通过藏族民间故事了解和接受藏族文化。显然这是一个再简单不过的一种方式，简单、隐忍、不主动，完全依靠冥冥中的缘分和前进，这样一种方式在藏文化的语境中也是一种特殊的方式。我说的意思就是说，没有过分的借助一些个宣传和强调，只是加了2个字。我对这样一种方式的理解是，在藏文化的语境当中，当一个人需要抵达某种成就的时候，他所采用的方式却是极为简单的，那就是用微弱的不断累加，让它积少成多，最终在谁也预想不到的时候达到蔚为壮观的效果。比如，每一个藏族人都会面对以成佛为目的的这样一种修炼过程，那是依据藏传佛教转世的理念，将自己前生后世几辈子的时间 要花费去，进而完成的一个浩大的工程。但是藏民族采用了一个极其简单的修行方式，那就是手持佛珠、念经、转经、磕头等，看上去非常的微不足道，目的却是非常的宏大。我认为万马才旦的电影、小说作品，随时都能看到这种好像是玉无深处的这种表达方式。这样一种方式也成为万马才旦先生用艺术的方式抵达或者抵近他所钟爱的藏文化的一种方式。所以他的这种艺术追求呢，就有一种修炼那样的一种意味。下面我说说万马才旦先生的这个短篇小说的一些作品。他的文学创作基本上是以短篇小说为主的。他的小说呢，深受民间文学的影响，带着鲜明的藏族民间故事、民间传说的特点。我认为，有一种民间叙事的一种特点。民间叙事甚至成了他的一种文本的一种特征，一种一贯的一种风格。比如他的短篇小说《寻找阿克图巴》，讲的是一个民间文学工作者去寻找一位民间艺术家，继而听到这位艺术家的3个不同版本的经历的故事。在这篇小说里，万马才旦在语言结构、语调等方面完全采用了民间故事的叙事方式，并做了一次民间故事被改写的这样一种实验。他不厌其烦地把这一个故事写了3遍。在这种的民间故事的仿写中，从文本精神上，万马才旦也透露出民间文学继续传承的重要性，以及民间文学对民众精神和品质形成塑造的重要性。这个故事里头呢，他还不惜以一种极端的方式塑造了一个这样的一个人物。他就这个人物不惜以一种极端的方式保护民间文化的一个还苏喇嘛。这个还苏喇嘛的名字就叫阿卡图巴。阿卡图巴甚至采用了搭建一顶帐篷，为过路的客人提供简单的食宿的这样一种方式，恳求陌生的客人给自己讲一段故事。从这个人物身上，似乎也可以看到万马才旦隐忍克制却又锲而不舍的一种艺术的一种诉求。在万马才旦先生的作品当中，民间故事的被改写似乎是一种象征意义。这种被改写的过程缓慢沉静，似乎是有一种难以察觉的这样一种理念，但是它又是发生着的，时时刻刻紧密关联着我们的生活。我们的生活就是这样在玉无深处的改变中被改写中，渐次地走向异化，走向另一个面目。在这里，我想用万马才旦的电影，这是他的电影的处女作《静静的玛尼石》打一个比方。在进入这个话题之前，我想首先对这个片名中的2个词汇，也就是静静和玛尼石，做一个解释。这个看似没有必要，但我认为对理解万马才旦先生的作品，这个片名是非常重要的。在我看来，这样2个词汇在万马才旦的小说和电影作品中有一种类似寓言一样的寓意，有一种隐喻吧。先说说静静这个词，这是一个形容词。万马才旦试图用这样一种词汇表达被一种不动声色的表象所掩映下的一种平静和安宁。这个我认为是千百年来藏地的一种状态。由于海拔，由于缺氧，一切外在的过于激烈的运动都会受到限制，使得这里的一切都呈现出一种宁静的状态。这是自然赋予这片高原的一种情状。而就精神而言，佛教在藏地的传播，以及佛教中的一种以极静和延缓生命运动为目的的一种修行方式，也就是这个禅修，在藏地的普遍言传， 使得藏民族内心也有着与这片高原吧，与这个自然天地赋予的和暗示给他们的宁静非常契合的一种心态。所以，这片高原以及这片高原上的子民们的生活的追求，也呈现出一种静静的状态。第二个词汇是玛尼石。玛尼石呢是青藏高原藏地上的一道人文风景吧。它也更是这个藏民族精神和文化的一种外化的形象。在瓦玛才旦的电影作品和小说作品中，它也是一种外形，石头这样一种自然物去象征这片高原形体的。又以玛尼这样一种刻在这个石头上的文字去象征这片高原精神的所在。从这个意义上，我看来这两个词汇的巧妙的组合呢，就是理解和进入瓦玛才旦的小说世界和电影世界的一个秘密吧。我认为瓦玛才旦的这个电影作品和小说作品，跟这种民俗和跟这种民间的文化、文学和文化的这种融合是了无痕迹的，你就看不出一点痕迹。这个也体现在了瓦玛才旦在艺术作品的这种作品里头呈现民间文学的这种截取和运用上的一种巧妙。这个我写的比较长，可能时间可能来不及，我就尽量把一些重点说一说。瓦玛才旦的这个电影作品呢，不但有一种民间叙事的格调，同时也大量借用了许多的民间故事。比方说他的电影处女作《精进的玛尼石》，就是以这个小喇嘛带着电视机和 VCD 要到寺院，和自己的师父和寺院的小活佛共享电视连续剧《西游记》的故事。《西游记》这个故事在藏地是广为流传的，但藏族民间把这个故事的名字叫做《唐僧喇嘛传》。其实从这个名字上也可以看出藏文化背景下民间文学的一种被改写。比起唐僧师徒在去西天取经路上所遭遇的这种各种的这种奇遇和艰难，藏民族更看重取经这样一个极富意义的事业。这一点在瓦玛才旦这个作品当中，这个电影作品就是《精进的玛尼石》中也有反映。小喇嘛把《西游记》的电视连续剧的，就这个电影里头的一个情节啊，把《西游记》的这个电视连续剧带到寺院后，他自己却不能安心的去看电视剧，而承担起了类似当年那个中国的就跑偏那样的一个工作，不断的来回奔跑在自己和师父的这个僧舍之间，自己的僧舍和这个小活佛的府地之间。这时候，这个小活佛的师父就问小喇嘛，在他的僧舍里看电视的那些喇嘛们看到哪儿了？小喇嘛就回答，他们跳过了唐僧师徒4个人取经路上的故事，直接在看唐僧取经的故事。于是呢，小活佛的师父也劝小活佛，不要看路上的那种各种困难的部分，直接看唐僧取到了真经、结了善缘的部分。其实这一情节呢，反映的是在藏文化的背景下，《西游记》这个故事被重新定位和改写。文化对意义和作用的取向不同，使得这一故事从名字到民间关注的重点都有了很大的不一样。这个瓦玛才旦的这个《精进的玛尼石》这个作品里头出现了很多这个至美更登这样一部藏戏里头的很多的情节。这些情节呢，里头出现的这些情节，很多人认为是他这个至美更登的故事讲的是施舍的故事。这个里头，王子至美更登把自己的亲生的儿女以及自己的眼睛施舍给了别人，就是在汉文化的那种语境之下去看这种施舍的话，好像是非常的荒诞。但是瓦玛才旦的电影当中呢，恰好用的就是这个情节。我认为，这同样是在不同的文化背景对民间故事做出的一种取舍。瓦玛才旦是深知这一点，并完全依照 藏民族的思维方式，准确无误地截取了故事中的最感人、最有藏文化理念的情节。施舍对藏族来说，已经不是一个宗教意义上偶然为之的仪式，而是一种人生的态度。藏族，特别是藏族里头的游牧民族，几乎没有这个财产这种概念，认为财产就是藏族有一种说法，就是说他认为财产就是草尖上的露珠，随时会消失了，所以他认为这样的一种财产是没有保留的意义的。所以藏族将财产老是施舍给这个寺院和一些有这个贫困的一些人，最终也将自己的肉体呢，施舍给这个神鹰啊、鸟啊。我这个时间已经有一点差不多超了，我就加快我的这个我想试图表达的一个意思啊。刚才我讲了这个精进的玛尼什，后面我本来是要分析这个，还有比方说这个旺玛才旦的电影《知美根灯》，因为刚好是精进的玛尼什里头有这个知美根灯的一些藏戏的一些个片段，然后紧接着又是拍了一部电影叫《寻找知美根灯》，这个之间的联系是非常有意义的。紧接着他拍的一部电影就是《老狗》，旺玛才旦把这3部作品看成是他的故乡3部曲。其实老狗呢，已经是从这个民间故事里头淡化出来，这种淡化非常有意义，我觉得是它这种淡化反而是，故事本身又呈现出那种民间故事的样子来，而不在里头不再运用和选取这种民间故事。我认为旺玛才旦这么做的一个原因是，跟佛教有关系，或者说佛教当时进入藏区之后，它采用了一个传播的一种方式，就是借用民间故事，借用以前就有的一种民间故事，他把佛教的一些个理念和哲理，用民间故事的方式得到传播，或者是民间歌谣也有，比方说藏族的这个额尔楞格尔，也是这种把宗教的内容用这种故事传播的这样一种方式。我认为旺玛才旦的电影和小说也是有这样一种概念，它就是有一种自己想书写一部佛经这样一种冲动，用一种这样的方式呢，使得用自己的作品，用自己的电影和自己的小说作品，达到让自己的藏文化里头那种具有普世价值的那些东西得到更好的一种传播。我认为这是旺玛才旦的一种追求，这种追求也体现出了他作为一个藏族作家的这种敢于担当、敢于这个为自己的文化去做一份贡献的这种非常高尚的一种精神品质吧。好，谢谢大家。很乱啊。
Thank you very much, Long Ren-qing, for that inspiring view of Pema's work from a deeply Tibetan perspective. Do we have any quick questions for Long Ren-qing? We will come back also to ask questions at the end of the speakers' panels. Let's move quickly. But we're looking forward to your presentation. So please go ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The topic of my paper is called Tales That Travel, Reading Pema Tseden's Stories from a Non-Tibetan Viewpoint. So obviously this is a suicidal attempt by being politically incorrect. But I always think that everybody thinks Pema Tseden produces Tibetan works. But let's not forget there is this film called the flare trousers one, 喇叭裤在飘荡在1983, which has absolutely nothing to do with Tibet. This paper explores possible ways of reading Pema Tseden's stories when they are read in translations or across cultures. Before I start, I have 2 clarifications to make. First, when alluding to Pema Tseden's short stories, I intend to refer to his Chinese opus. I regret that I do not read Tibetan, so it is uncertain whether the content of this paper is equally relevant to his Tibetan stories. Second, my reason for eschewing Tibetan culture as the reading framework is intended as an experimental position. Naturally, Tibetan culture is a key to understanding his stories, and my aim is not to create a competing reading, but rather a complementary one which can be juxtaposed with existing ways of reading them, together with alternative perspectives that are yet to emerge. This hermeneutic experiment has been prompted by my experience of translating Pema Tseden's two stories, Where the Moon Rises and The Ninth Man. So perhaps it is one that represents the translator's point of view. I would suggest that translators read their texts differently, since their readings are always underpinned by the assumption of a readership from the other side of the linguistic and cultural divide. Translation readers are as varied as the readers of the source texts from which they derive. Some translation readers might be reading the texts in order to get to know the source culture. Some are interested in the literary qualities of the text rather than the source culture. Then there are always happy-go-lucky readers who simply enjoy reading. The job of the translator is, first, to be a critic. That is, to scout the text and explore in breadth and in depth the potential for a variety of readings and meanings. The next step is to try to create a text that will facilitate all kinds of readings and imaginative possibilities hinted at in the source text. In order to allow the text to grow and expand rather than to be constricted by the source text's apparent referential framework. When I read Pema Tseden's stories as their translator, I keep asking myself what the readers would see in these stories if they have no knowledge of Tibetan culture, or if their focus of attention is not ethnographic. Would these stories also be attractive to such an audience? What is it about these stories that would make them attractive to these more peripheral readers? In other words, is it possible to read these stories outside the Tibetan framework and still find them rich and meaningful? At this juncture, I must stress that I'm not advocating what might perhaps be called a deculturated reading. I'm simply, I see Casey smiling, I'm simply, as a translator, acknowledging the fact that such kind of reading exists, and indeed is a more general phenomenon than experts would like it to be. Consequently, I do not intend to foreground the Tibetan significance of these stories. Instead, I intend to leave it in the background and as the background, and focus on the narrative structure and language use we find in the stories. This method can help the reader to discover another way into Pema Tseden's creativity. Allow me first to describe what I see in these stories, reading in the way I've just suggested. The general impression these stories have created is a sense of the faux naïf, or false naivety. In other words, they read as artfully simple tales. I attribute this quality to a number of narrative and linguistic techniques and devices manifested in these stories. The first and most obvious of these features is the design of the characters. In many of Pema Tseden's stories, characters traditionally associated with innocence, such as children, young lamas, or inexperienced women in rural villages, feature frequently. These characters, and even the other characters less associated with the quality of innocence, are often characterized as being guileless, straightforward, almost excessively candid. For example, the character Talo at the beginning of the tale of the same name is recognized by the village police as soon as he enters the police station. Being a very down-to-earth shepherd without much concern for worldly vanities, he has no idea how the policeman could recognize him. He is amazed at the ability of the police to work out who he is. According to the narrative, Talo was slightly surprised. I'm quoting the text. He looked at the policeman's face and asked him, "How'd you know?" The policeman smiled and said, "We policemen naturally know more than other people do." Talo couldn't help admiring him and said, "No wonder you have surely caught some of the thieves." The policeman does note that, unquote, the policeman does note that this comment about him catching some of the thieves can also be understood as a remark about him not catching all of the thieves. But this remark is made more as a factual observation than as an ironic put down on the part of the character. It is exactly the innocence of the speaker's intention that constitutes the wicked humor of the situation. Snow, or Gang, as the Chinese version is entitled, tells the story of a brother and sister whose bodies are transparent. When famine strikes, they make the decision to allow tourists to see the brother's body in order to make money to feed the village. They are unreservedly trusting, generous, and magnanimous. At the same time, their deeds are not motivated by any considerations of grandiose heroism. They simply do it out of the most instinctual human feelings for life. Please note that I've avoided the concept of compassion for the reasons I've stated at the beginning. Although at the end of the story, people motivated by greed attempt to distort their pure goodness into an exploitative opportunity for commercial profit, the brother and sister escape back to the realm of the deities where they have come from. Innocence remains intact at the end of the story. I'd like to add that this story could, of course, be easily and rather obviously interpreted as a parable of Tibet's socio-political situation. But I've resisted dwelling on this, again for the reasons I've explained at the onset, because I'm trying not to read these stories within the Tibetan framework. Readers of Pema Tseden's stories often find such virtues of simplicity and artlessness characteristic of their personas. Even those who exploit others are hardly described as being scheming. Only their actions and the resulting problems for the main characters are related, often in the most matter-of-fact manner. The overall effect is an absence of negativity in the stories. Certainly harm and evil are never far from the surface, but they come across more as the causes or logical consequences of the persona's decisions and actions, rather than as the object of reflection or criticism. As in some realistic and didactic literature would do, and here I'm using the word didactic in the Brechtian sense. Connected to this is the minimalist narrative of these stories. Except for one or two more cinematic ones, the most outstanding example being Ugen's teeth, almost all of Pema Tseden's stories are devoid of detail of actions and emotions other than absolutely necessary narrative description. The plots are always stripped to the bare minimum. Portrayal of the characters' psychological and emotional modulations are often restricted to the shortest possible account of facial expression in single sentences. Some critics have attributed this external treatment of Pema Tseden's characters to the writer's cinematic thinking, suggesting that it represents an application of cinematic techniques grafted onto the writer-director's literary works. I don't agree with this view. Instead, I see this more as a deliberately and consistently cultivated writing strategy. Firstly, the method does not allow any distraction by the imagination based on everyday emotional logic, which might lead to the desublimation of spiritual overtone created by the magical events of the narrative. Please note again that I'm using the word magical here for the lack of a better word, and that I haven't attempted to explain the presence of the magical events in Pema Tseden's stories as something that is consistent with the assumed Tibetan religious worldview. Secondly, this studied avoidance of emotional description works in tandem with at least one other textual feature that we can identify, which will be analyzed shortly. Together, these textual features has accumulated to become a very distinctive pattern of effective management of narrative that is too central and too deeply embedded in the text to be explained away simply as an extension of the writer-director's cinematic practices. This other textual feature I have noticed is the absence of elaboration of the material world. Traditionally, critics of fictions value the construction of lifelike worlds in narrative universe of a novel or a short story. The more complicated this narrative universe, the more comprehensively the circumstances of the characters tend to come across. And the most successful the fiction is often considered. Familiar examples are, of course, Dickens or the Chinese Hong Lang Meng. The characters of these fictional masterpieces are constructed and understood through their engagement with the people, material reality, and events around them. Readers would see these characters as multifaceted social beings. Then, by reading about the typical characters of such works, readers would understand the particular character under general existential conditions and in specific social circumstances. However, this common practice is not the direction taken in Pema Tseden's stories. The cautiously sparse descriptions of the material world of the narrative limit the engagement of the characters to the external world to the level of bare necessity for narrative flow. As a result, Pema Tseden's characters are mostly delineated in a focused rather than a distracted mode. The character's evocation tends to be focused on the single action that character is doing at that moment of the tale, or on the single interlocutor that they are speaking to, and most importantly, on a single issue that they are engaged with. Such minimalism combined with a general lack of dramatic language sounds like the required recipe for tedious fiction. However, this is not the case for Pema Tseden's tales. The drama in his stories never come from elaboration of dramatic elements, but from the expensive imagination of the plots. Let me cite two pertinent examples. Where the moon rises, 月亮升起来了, is a little gem of a story spanning a mere 4 pages. Two characters, probably children, go to check out the places where the moon rises and where it sets. Where it rises is the future, and they see the moon turning red. It is a dark night and the land cracks open. Where the moon sets is the past, and the moon is white. The night sky is silvery, and the land is lush with verdant pasture. One of the two characters sees the horror of the future, and the other sees the beauty of the past. Together they walk back towards the past. The drama of this tiny piece resides in the idea. The descriptions of the characters, their affective responses, and even the material world are all represented in extremely minimalist and economical style. But the literary effects produced is profound. I'd like to use the musical form of the chant to explain this. Chants are a rhythmic method of recitation involving intoning words or non-referential phonemes into musical notes. The melodies are never dramatic. The interval of the musical notes are often narrow and repetitive. Chants are more often than not used in religious occasions. Many of the chants, although sounding monotonous, carry intense religious emotions and connotations. However, nobody would accuse religious chants of poor coordination between the emotional quality of the words and that of the music, since the actual performance of the chants in religious ceremonies have proven objectively the effectiveness of chanting. The emotional intensity created by chanting is not an expressive one. Instead, the dramatic quality of the events and monotony of the sound combine to create a contrast which changes the experience created by that monotony. Functioning somewhat like an incantation, this monotony becomes swelled with the magnitude of dramatic quality of the event which has not been expressed by lexical or other text rhetorical means. This is a meditative quality created by the structure and acts on the subliminal, or alternatively, the higher level of the reader's consciousness. In music, this compositional strategy is very commonly adopted outside religious music, including in popular music. Many of Leonard Cohen's songs we are very familiar with have been composed in such a way. The Xinjiang Kazakh musician Mamer has also adopted this form in all his recent compositions. Both of them tend to highlight this quality of their melodies with a drone continuo on the lower register in a sonic foreground. What happens in this kind of music is that the intervals of musical notes in a melody determines the dramatic quality of what I call the emotionscape of the melody. The presence of this dramatic quality in the composition of a chant, which is conducive to meditation, pushes the emotions created by the events to the level of the subconscious. This is also how Pema Tseden's writing works. The stories, stripped of the dramatic elaboration of the narrative events, have the same effect of containing the emotionscape of the narrative. The rejection of dramatic elaborations functions like the absence of vivid and dramatic motifs in a typical song chant. For this to work, however, is a literary device. For this to work, however, As a literary device, another formal property of chance is also found in Pema Tseden's narratives, which is repetition, which Patricia has actually very generously pointed that out to me in our first conversation. Repetition in his stories is consistently practiced on two levels, one lexical and the other structural. The lexical level repetition could escape detection by fast readers, but if one reads slowly, one would notice frequent repetition of certain words. The traditional stylistic need for lexical variation is not adopted. Basically, if the same words can be used, the same phrase is used repeatedly within a single paragraph. The opening paragraph of the story, Where the Moon Rises, is a good illustration of this. Let me quote a very short paragraph. It starts with, "The moon has risen. The scarlet moon has risen from the mountains in the east, casting scarlet moonlight across the barren, open country." And then the two characters are sitting side by side. They are gazing at the boundless country washed by the scarlet moonlight. At the limits of visibility is an expanse of barrenness. Not even a single flower grows there. Nothing but a lifelike silence prevails. Now, a simple type token ratio check would show this as a general textual feature. This is a strategy used in corpus linguistics that counts the ratio of the number of different words to the total number of words in the text. I must admit that at first I was baffled by such lexical repetition. I even suspected it to be an effect of a second language writer, which is common among second language creative writers. But as I read on, it becomes apparent that the incidence of textual repetition has created an unusual quality of density in the text. Due to the recurrence of these lexical items, they become stylistically marked and provide an anchor for readers' attention. Again, a mode of concentrated rather than distracted reading is promoted. Structural repetition is one of the most noted features in Pema Tseden's stories. His most controversial piece, The Ninth Man, is structured entirely around repetition. The story starts with Yeung recounting her previous 8 relationships with various men. The narrative is punctuated by its structurally identical motifs and thematic treatment. This is the closing part of how she recounts her first man. This was Yeung story with her first man. She told her man all about it. She withheld nothing from him. This ninth man of her smiled and said, "This is the delight between men and women. One simply can't fight it, and it is what has led me to you." Words like this could no longer move her. Her face stayed expressionless. After the story of a second man, there's a recapitulation of this narrative technique. This was Yeung story of the second man of hers. She told her ninth man all about it. She did not withhold anything. Her story made him angry, and he said it was wicked of him. She heard what he said, and she took a look at him. Likewise, after the story of her third man. This was Yeung story about her third man. She told her ninth man all about this, leaving out nothing. This ninth man of hers scoffed and said, "There are no decent traders in the world. They are all deceitful and greedy." On hearing this, she looked at him again. By the way, yesterday I told Pema Tseden how I read this story as a tale of exploitation, and he objected to my opinion vehemently, notwithstanding this is my view. 昨天其实我跟万马才旦讲到第9个男人这个故事的时候，我跟他说，我觉得这一个是讲剥削的故事，他义无反顾地反对我的看法，但是这还是我的看法。The entire piece is structured around this repetition. In between these punctuations are the careful developed plot of the female protagonist's experience of being subjected to a series of exploitative relationships. Again, I'd like to use a musical analogy to emphasize this structural feature. The story is constructed like a rondo. Episodes or digressions are planted between the refrains. Embellishments and adjustments are accommodated into refrains to provide variations. In fact, the use of a chorus is very common in many musical forms. They provide an anchorage point for the reader's attention, reinforcement of empathy, and a sense of structure. Professor Barnett, something very embarrassing has happened. I have lost the last page of my paper. Can I borrow the last page from the interpreter? I'm very, very sorry. The interpreters down there.
To give her an extra 2 minutes for her last page.
Oh, she hasn't got the last page. Oh, he's here. See ya. Let me do the sentence again. They provide an anchorage point for the reader's attention, reinforcement of empathy, and a sense of structure that always promotes concentration and rhythm in listening as well as in reading. But let me propose another possible connection, Labov and Prop. Among many other linguists and narratologists, they have highlighted the importance of recursive narrative structures. Labov and other linguists have identified recursion as a narrative strategy to achieve a wide range of discursive purposes, including the promotion of narrative credibility. Prop has also identified a recursive narrative structure as a major element in his theory of the morphology of folklore. Such extensive use of structural repetition in music in folklore can be explained by the oral nature of both. There are many other corpora of early writings which demonstrate similar strategies. Many of these have been passed down orally and only later written down. They include folk tales of many cultures and, of course, religious writings. I'm not trying to argue here that these narrative forms have any intrinsic religious quality, but their long association with religious texts have endowed them with an association of spirituality that has developed in people's reading habits and indeed in the human mind. Some 20th century writers have applied these recursion and in some cases parable-like narrative forms to their own writings. Notable examples are, of course, Brecht and Kafka in their respective collections of short stories. Some other colleagues have already mentioned the relationship between Kafka and Pema Tseden earlier. I'm sure there are many more authors writing in different languages which have perhaps not yet caught the eyes of international literary critics in respect of this particular characteristic. The parable tales of Brecht and Kafka have made use of many of the narrative strategies of folklore and have made use of the association of these forms to faith and historical wisdom in order to express what they see as non-religious but human spiritual truths. If we read Pema Tseden's stories according to such a framework, one can see that he is tapping into a tradition of human expression which is arguably more inclusive than the kind of cultural specificity intuited from a more ethnographically oriented reading. This tradition is simply what we call literature. To clarify, I'm not trying to argue for forms of literary expression which are, for example, pre-cultural or pan-cultural or ultra-cultural in a methodology that intercultural dramatists have notably pursued to very little avail. In fact, in this day and age, so many literary resources are so readily available to so many people. If you read Pema Tseden's Weibo, you will notice the huge range of literature he references from his own reading interests. Tibetan culture is definitely the wellspring of his stories, no question. But I contend that their themes and concerns extend to realms far beyond Tibet. Naturally, recognizing that Tibetan texture is very important too. In a rondo structure, much of the delight resides in the section where variation occurs. The Tibetan context and experience are both the driving force behind and the content of these stories, unquestionably. At the same time, by tapping into a more general literary tradition, his stories participate in the discursive, affective, and cognitive fields, which are intrinsic to the human condition. Like those of Kafka and Brecht, Pema Tseden's parables have expressed what the writer sees as spiritual truths that are relevant to the human race. That is, to people who are both within and without the Tibetan cultural context. So to conclude, if you ask me whether Pema Tseden produces either Tibetan literature or world literature, I will say Yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yeung, and for excellent recovery from loss of final pay.